So the reason I wanted to do this episode was, several weeks ago I saw reports, and I'll put a link to one of the articles. That's from The Guardian. I'll put that in the episode description. But I was seeing all these reports about American soldiers complaining that their commanding officers were talking about how God had sanctioned them to go to war. Reading from this article in The Guardian, it says, quote, complainants report the unrestricted euphoria of their commanders who perceive a biblically sanctioned war that is clearly the undeniable sign of the expeditious approach of the fundamentalist Christian end times. And so when I saw that, I was like, oh my God, we're going to war because of Left Behind. Welcome to Shoulda Books, the podcast about all the books you should have read by now. My name is Jonathan, and today, I'm doing something a little bit different today. So if you are new here, this is not the format that this podcast normally takes. No, normally I have a guest and I talk with them about the 3 books they think everyone should read. Or once a month, we have a book club episode where everyone reads along. We talk about it on Fable. We talk about it on the Shoulda Books Discord. And at the end of the month, I record an episode where I talk about the book. This is not going to be either of those. This is going to be an episode about a book that I don't think you should read as a reader. That's a weird phrasing. This is a book that I don't think you should read for pleasure. I don't think this is a book you should read for fun. Certainly not a book you should read for any sort of worldview or doctrinal purposes, but I think it's worth knowing about for world events and understanding said events. I'm talking, you already saw it in the thumbnail, I'm talking about the Left Behind series by Tim LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins. This was a book that, it was a series of books that was incredibly formative in my life. And it's incredibly formative in American Evangelical Christianity. That was the world that I grew up in and have since left. It's important to note that. American Evangelical Christianity is one of the driving forces of the Trump administration. Certainly not the only force driving the Trump administration. It's not the only force driving America, but it's incredibly powerful and influential. And these books really shaped that psyche in a way that I think gets talked about some, but not enough. And so today I want to try to just start that conversation. This certainly isn't the end of that conversation. I am not a theologian. These books are so theologically dense, and I'm basically just going to scratch the surface of them. I'm probably going to get a lot of things wrong. And I'm just going to say that at the top. You can let me know what I'm getting wrong about dispensational premillennialism and things of that nature. I'm also, not a foreign policy expert, but I'm not really an expert on anything. But I'll tell you what I am is someone who read these books at a very, very formative time and had them shape the way that not only that I saw the world, but how I saw myself. And I'm also someone with eyes and ears who can see what is happening in the world. So right now, the United States and Israel are at war with Iran, and I do not support this war. I don't think we should be doing it. And I know I'm not alone. I don't know the poll numbers. I'm not a pollster either, but I know that this is an incredibly unpopular war, and I think it's an evil war. I don't think it should be happening. So it's going to be a loose episode. It's just me today, no guest. I want to try to give, just tell my story of what it was like reading these books and what they meant to me and how they really just scared me. Like they really, really scared me. And I think they've scared a lot of people. So I want to kind of speak to that experience. And I also want to kind of, give an overview for people who have no idea what the hell I'm talking about. If that's you, congratulations, but I do think it's important to kind of know where these ideas are coming from, and it can start to make some really irrational decisions made by the people in power It doesn't make them less rational, but it does make them make sense with a certain lens. So what are these books about? Writ large, these books are about the rapture and the apocalypse as interpreted by people like one of the co-authors, Tim LaHaye. We're going to get into the weeds of the theology and the Bible interpretation, but basically the very kind of back of the envelope Sparks Notes version of this is that some people think that the Bible foretells, the end times, and that certain events are going to happen, namely the rapture, which is where Jesus goes, poof, all the believers, all the real Christians, not the fake ones, all the real Christians disappear and they're taken to heaven, poof, in the blink of an eye. And everyone else is left to deal with the fallout. And after that happens, there's 7 years. It's called the tribulation. During those 7 years, the world is racked by various plagues. You may have heard of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. That's where this comes from. Those represent different plagues that are unleashed on the world. Through it all, the Antichrist rises to prominence and gains control of the world government. It all culminates in the Battle of Armageddon, where the forces of evil, led by the Antichrist, are finally vanquished by the forces of good, led by Jesus Christ, coming back down with all the people that he raptured before, plus all the saints and everyone who, believed before these times. Anyway, if it sounds like fantasy, brother, let me tell you, it is. And but it's a story that has gripped the imaginations of millions and has made a lot of money for the authors and publishers of this series. So the first book, Left Behind, was published in 1995. I was born in 1992, so I don't remember when this book came out. So it's just kind of always been there. It's just always been in the ether. It's always been around. I remember the first time that I started reading it was not actually the adult Left Behind books, because again, these books they're marketed towards adults. They would have sat on the shelf next to the Da Vinci Code, but because there was a buck to be made, they also did a children's series. So they had 50 of these little slim books left behind. I think it was called Left Behind the Kids. And I remember stumbling upon these in the young adult section of the library in this little small town that I lived in North Carolina. And I knew of the adult version, which I was not allowed to read. And I saw there's the kids version. Oh, interesting. My parents were like, yeah, that's fine. You can read that. It's in the young adult section. It's Christian. Of course, you could go for it. As long as it's not Harry Potter. As long as it's not Harry Potter, you can go for it. This would have been, probably 2002, 2003. So 9/11 had happened. I'm a millennial, obviously. So I don't need to talk about how much 9/11 loomed in, the mind of people my age, but it did. It was a time that really did feel apocalyptic. I was just old enough to have some sense of the world before 9/11. Look, I was one of those kids who liked watching the news, mainly because it impressed the adults around me. They're like, whoa, that's crazy that you know about this current event that's happening. I remember when we went to war with Afghanistan. I remember when we went to war with Iraq. And I remember how much people talked about the end times at the time and how popular these books were at the time. I remember being surprised when it became the year 2003. I was surprised that it was the year 2003 because I thought the rapture would have happened by then, and it didn't. I never expected to be an adult. I never expected to be a teenager, frankly. I certainly didn't expect to graduate high school or graduate college or start a career. I really didn't think it was going to happen because I thought I was going to get raptured. I really thought that the rapture was going to happen, and it was 100% because of these books. So the first book sets the stage. We have 4 main characters. We've got Rayford Steele, which it really sounds like a porn star. I have to say Rayford Steele. He's a transatlantic airline pilot, and he's cheating on his wife. We're following his daughter Chloe, a college student who is she's like 20, I think. We're following Cameron Buck Williams, who is a journalist and played by Kirk Cameron in the movie. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I just can't. I can't see the name Buck Williams without picturing Cameron without picturing Kirk Cameron's ridiculous face. And then finally, we're following Bruce Barnes, who is a pastor who, doesn't get raptured because he's not actually a believer. So the rapture takes place while Rayford is piloting a jet airliner across the Atlantic Ocean. Buck is on that plane, and all of a sudden they realize, whoa, there's people on this plane who just all of a sudden they've gone missing. Their clothes are still here, but they must be running around naked. What's going on? And then they start to hear over the radio, they're like, whoa, something crazy has actually happened. And it's, the fact that a tenth or so of the world's population has just vanished in the blink of an eye. And as you can imagine, led to, some plane crashes, some car crashes, some, all sorts of horrendous violence and cataclysm. Again, it came out in 1995, so it precedes 9/11 by a good 6 years. But I think that it can be viewed in the same lens as things like Independence Day and the aptly titled Michael Bay film Armageddon. So if you've ever seen the documentary Hypernormalization by Adam Curtis, he does this really interesting montage set to the song Dream Baby Dream by Suicide, which is a song that I really like. It's a montage that one could argue is too long, but it shows all of these scenes from movies and TV shows that show major cities being destroyed. And they all came out before 9/11. So it's all through the 90s, kind of starting in the late 80s, all through the 90s, up until 2001, there is just instance after instance of art or entertainment depicting destruction. And I think these books kind of slot into that as well. I don't know what and how or why that was a thing, but it just seemed like subconsciously people could feel that something bad was going to happen. And I think that's part of why these books are so popular, is they fed into that feeling. We can debate what causes that feeling. I think that it's probably a recognition, a subconscious recognition that a country can't just kind of go around the world destroying things and not have some sort of repercussion, not have some sort of consequence. I think that might have something to do with it. But like I said, that can be debated and is beyond the scope of this humble episode. So that's kind of where it starts. From there, our four main characters realize what has happened. They realize that the rapture has happened. Where are all of these predictions coming from? They're coming from the mind of Tim LaHaye, who was the co-author. Basically, the way the writing duties broke down for these books was that LaHaye kind of crunched the numbers, crunched the biblical numbers, and was like, okay, here's what I think is going to happen. And then was the scribe who actually wrote it down. So Tim LaHaye, he was a pastor, he was an author, he was very influential in the American Evangelical movement of the late 20th century. He was one of the people who convinced Jerry Falwell to start the Moral Majority. The Moral Majority is a whole rabbit hole that we could also go down. Maybe I'll do an episode about it. But the Moral Majority was one of the institutions that helped turn American evangelical Christians onto politics. Before the Moral Majority, which was formed ahead of the 1980 election, evangelical Christians didn't have the same obsession with power that you see now. They stayed out of politics a little bit more. Tim LaHaye was a big player in that movement. Jerry B. Jenkins, who was before this a sports writer, he was also ghost authored, ghost wrote or co-wrote a lot of memoirs. He was just kind of a gun for hire, but a Christian and one who believed the same doctrine that LaHaye believed. And that doctrine is called dispensationalism. So we're going to put on our theologian hat for a second and get really into the weeds. I promise that it is interesting. Well, actually, I don't promise that it's interesting, but I promise that it's important to this discussion. So dispensationalism is the theological belief and framework for interpreting the Bible that holds that God speaks to humans in different ways, aka dispensations. He speaks to us in dispensations throughout time. So the first dispensation is the Garden of Eden. That's where God has direct communion with his creation, with Adam and Eve. Following, the fall of man or whatever, it becomes a different dispensation. And then there's various ones. We could go through the Old Testament, but I'm not gonna. But basically this idea that like the rules change based on the state of play. A very, very important point with dispensationalism, and it cannot be stressed enough, is that it is a literal interpretation of the Bible. And when I say literal, it means that when Genesis says that, God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, they literally believe that it is 6 calendar days that it was created. Anytime the Bible makes a claim, when it says that Methuselah was 969 years old, they believe that it was 969 rotations around the sun. It's literal. This is not the way that other denominations, other strains of Christianity view the Bible. The Catholics don't view it this way. The mainline Protestant denominations, like the mainline Presbyterians and Methodists and Lutherans, for instance, do not view the world this way. But the people who do view the world this way are predominantly American evangelicals. That's Baptists, especially the Southern Baptists. That's, non-denominational churches. That is a lot of charismatic churches. They view the Bible this way, that it is a document that is to be taken literally. Where that is important for this discussion is that they take what is written in the book of Revelation as literal. That these are literal interpretations of things that are going to happen. And so that is what Left Behind is all about. It's dramatizing these predictions that are, again, interpretations of ancient texts, 2,000 years old, or older, because there's also books in the Old Testament that they are pulling from. So that's one thing to note, that this is a literal framework, a literal interpretation of the Scripture. Another thing to note is that it's recent. It really has not been a part of Christian dogma for that long. It really started in the early to mid 19th century with a guy named John Nelson Darby. So John Nelson Darby was a British pastor who made this framework and this way of interpreting Scripture, especially the end times prophecy, made that popular in the 1830s. And so it didn't really catch on in the same way in Britain as it did in America. So in America, it really took off throughout the latter part of the 19th century. And then in the early 20th century, it was kind of crystallized with the publication of the Scofield Reference Bible. This was a Bible that took the King James Version and then added a bunch of notes, a bunch of like footnotes basically of saying, well, this is what that means. And this idea of, taking mainly the book of Revelation, but also the books of Daniel and some verses in Ezekiel and other verses kind of scattered throughout, some other New Testament verses as well, taking these literally and putting them together into this idea that the rapture is going to happen, believers are going to be taken up into the clouds, and that bad things are going to befall the earth, including the rise of the Antichrist. To bring this all back to the beginning, what the hell were those generals talking about then? That like this is, biblically sanctioned to bring about the expeditious return of Jesus Christ. Well, there's different, ways of viewing the end times within kind of this dispensationalist approach. There's premillennialism, there's postmillennialism. That's all very in the weeds, but basically they all kind of agree that this final battle between good and evil needs to happen in the Middle East for Jesus to come back. That the forces of good have to triumph over the forces of evil, the forces of Satan. That has to happen in the Middle East before Jesus can return. So I don't know specifically what brand of this thinking these generals believe in. I don't know to what extent people like Pete Hegseth or Donald Trump believe in this stuff. Trump certainly doesn't, because I don't think he believes in anything besides himself. Hegseth, his theology is, I mean, that could be its own episode. Maybe not an episode of Shoulda Books, but episode of something. Wow, what a fucked up individual. I don't know exactly what they believe, but basically all of these strains of thought kind of agree that like the final battle is going to happen in the Middle East, and that a war between the forces of good, which is i.e. America, and the forces of Satan, which is, for a lot of evangelicals, is Islam. They really do believe that like Islam is evil incarnate and that it has to be vanquished. I mean, this is shit that goes back to the Crusades, right? The thing that is the most frustrating is not even the right word. The thing that's most terrifying is that some of these prophecies might come true because of people willing them to come true. Like, there could be a battle that ends the world in the Middle East because of these people thinking this way. And it's not inevitable. It's because of their choice. And that is the hardest thing to live with. These are all views that are very recent. And I think it maps onto the American psyche very well. And the reason for that is I think that the whole kind of engine of America is individualism, right? It's don't tread on me, emphasis on me. It's all about me. And I think that Christians throughout history have not been as selfish, because there's something very selfish about thinking that the world is going to end during your lifetime. Christians certainly don't have a monopoly on this. I think that if you ask most people, certainly my age and younger, if you ask them if they think that the world is going to end during their lifetime, they would probably say yes. And look, there is certainly data to back that up. I'm not denying that in any way, shape, or form. Climate change is bad, and it is getting worse, and the prognosis does not look good. Nuclear war is back on the table. I guess it was never off the table, but boy, does it feel pertinent right now. Again, I am recording this on April 7th, 2026, before the big scary deadline that Trump has given Iran to open the Strait of Hormuz. There could be nuclear war next week. It could happen. But I do think that there is something that is inherently individualistic about thinking that history is going to end during your lifetime, because it means that everything that has come before has led to me. It's all about me. It's all about this moment right now. I think that is something that is very deep in the American psyche, which is that it's all about us. And even if it's something as scary and terrifying as the world ending, it still means it's about us. I think that's part of why it has kind of taken off here. And it's kind of a chicken and egg situation, of like which comes first. But I think that if you really believe this stuff, if you really believe that all the good people are going to get zapped up to heaven and all the bad people are going to suffer for 7 years, and then Jesus is going to come back and judge everyone and finally put to death, eternal death, all the evil. There's a bloodlust to that thinking that I certainly see in American evangelicalism. That again, I don't know if it's a function of this kind of thinking, or if this kind of thinking is something that appeals to those people because they have it. But there's a brutality to it, right? Of like almost salivating at the idea that millions and millions, billions of people are going to die. The things that happen in the Left Behind series, it's famines, it's nuclear war, it's demons. There's one book where there are these like demons that have like the body of a horse and the like tails that are snakes, and they like come down and like wreak havoc, again because it's a literal interpretation, and that's kind of the imagery that's used in the book of Revelation. Evangelicals relish violence. When I was growing up, the books and the movies and the TV shows that were allowed were things that were violent. Violence was okay content-wise, but any sort of sexual content, any sort of bad language, that's not allowed, but violence is okay. A movie like Braveheart is a great example. Evangelicals love Braveheart. Mel Gibson, he made The Passion of the Christ, one of the most brutal, gory movies ever made. That is all okay, but anything else, God forbid you watch two people who love each other have sex. That's awful. We can't see that. But we can watch someone be brutally dismembered in front of us. That's okay. I don't know. It doesn't make sense when you look at what Jesus actually said. Things like turn the other cheek, love thy neighbor as thyself. It's so banal to point out those hypocrisies. And it also doesn't fucking make a difference to point out those hypocrisies. But I think they are worth being pointed out, For this war in particular, we have to talk about the Israel of it all. That is a huge, huge part of this way of viewing the Bible, this dispensationalism, because dispensationalists believe that there are promises that are made to the state of Israel, and there are promises made to the church, and those are separate. Other denominations, like Catholics, for instance, believe in what's called covenant theology. That's the kind of the big opponent of dispensationalism, and covenant theology sees it as God's promises are for everyone. But evangelicals, especially the ones who believe dispensationalism, believe that God has made certain promises to the state of Israel, and he's made certain promises to the church, and both are going to be fulfilled. And so the fate of Israel is like inextricably tied to the fate of the church in the minds of evangelicals. And that's why there is such a staunch devotion, even when you have an Israeli government that is committing a genocide, that is starting wars, that is brutally killing civilians. We are lockstep with them. And I think that a huge part of that is because of this brand of Christianity. That's certainly not the only reason that we are, sending weapons and funding the brutality that has been committed against, Palestinians and the people in Lebanon, and many, many others. It's certainly not the only reason, but it's probably the biggest, if I had to take a stab at guessing. And I think that understanding this mode of thinking helps bring that into a sharper focus. I'm recording this episode in Rome. I'm staying literally like a 5-minute walk from the Vatican. And so I have been surrounded and inundated with Christianity for the past couple of weeks. I think that the Catholic Church is certainly not a perfect institution. One could even say it's not even a good institution. I think that the way that they covered up and probably continue to cover up sexual abuse is pretty heinous, and I don't stand for that. But what I will say is, Pope Leo is out there, speaking against war and speaking against brutality and speaking against this bloodlust. And I think that's important. And I think that we need more voices like that are basically talking about, the love your neighbor as yourself, like that side of Christianity. I just don't understand the mental gymnastics you have to do to take what, is attributed to Jesus and be like, yeah, we have to bomb the hell out of these people. We have to bomb them back to the Stone Age. I just, again, I understand it because I grew up in it. And I understand that, like, when all of the voices around you are saying one thing, it's really hard to see beyond that, And I think that is why evangelicalism I think it's a very brittle worldview. It's a worldview that requires you to constantly be selling. It's almost like a pyramid scheme. It's like you constantly have to be sharing your faith and trying to get new converts. And I think part of that is because it's inextricably linked with capitalism, which is again, another rabbit hole we could go down that we don't have time for. But I think another part of it too is that if you are uncomfortable with a belief and you're worried that you might be wrong, one of the best ways to reassure yourself is to get someone to agree with you. If everyone around you is agreeing with you, then it's like, well, they can't all be wrong, right? They can't all be wrong. And so my experience with evangelicalism is that there was lip service paid to doubts, but there wasn't really weight given to it in a substantial way, if that makes sense. Like it was okay to say that you were doubting, but boy, you had better have it wrapped up once you read some C.S. Lewis quotes, and there's a refusal to grapple with any sort of ambiguity. And I think that regardless of what faith you have or lack thereof, I think that total certainty is not possible. It's just not possible as a human being. We can't be totally certain of anything. And so there needs to be a willingness to accept that, like, I could be wrong about this. And I know that some evangelicals do view their faith that way. And I commend them for that, because I think that it takes courage and it takes humility to admit that. But, my experience growing up, certainly going to a place like Liberty University, was that, like, that's not okay. And if you don't truly believe this, then you're a heretic and you're going to hell. That was my experience. And so I think that that maps very, very well onto, things like toxic masculinity and the way that someone like Pete Hegseth, for instance, or even Donald Trump is constantly having to project power because they feel weak. And so they're constantly trying to show that they're not weak. I think there's the same way of just like constantly having to show that you are a Christian because deep down you're worried that it might not be true. That's my take on it. And I could be wrong. But that's how I feel about it. And I know that this was kind of a rambling episode, but it is something that has kind of been on my heart in my mind for a while, and I felt like it was the time to start talking about it and to bring it up. I want to just kind of end on the note of like calling for peace and calling for understanding and calling for dialogue, for conversation. Yeah, let me know what your thoughts on this are. Let me know what blind spots I missed, because I'm sure I missed some. I know I missed some. Let me know how your experience with the Left Behind books was. Like, I feel like, I really haven't talked about the books themselves much, which I think is okay, because it's really not about the books. It's about the ideas and kind of what they stand for. Because again, the books are kind of, they're hacky. They're very hacky. But I think it could be fun to do a little bit more of a deep dive on the books themselves and on Christian fiction in general. Because again, these books didn't come out of a vacuum. They were part of at the time, a very vibrant publishing industry, which, the publishing industry writ large has shrunk a lot. But, during the 90s, there was certainly a lot of like Christian books that sold very well, and this was one of them. So I think it would be interesting to do a deep dive on our authors like Frank Peretti or, oh God, who's the other guy? I wanted to say Ted Decker. Is that his name? Yeah, it was Ted Decker. There's so many books like that I find really fascinating, and I think have influenced a lot of people that don't necessarily get talked about. So, let me know if there's other books that you would be interested in me exploring in that way. So I hope everyone is able to stay safe during all this, and I hope that you're able to cling to hope. That's really something that I'm trying to work on and find places to be hopeful about. And right now, one of those places is books. And for that reason, thank you to everyone for watching and for listening. I know this was kind of a chaotic episode, but thank you for being here. And as always, keep reading.